Gas stations are supposed to be safe, ordinary pit stops along a journey, bright lights cutting through the darkness, humming neon signs promising fuel, food, and a moment of rest. But what happens when the road is empty, the silence stretches on for hours, and the gas station becomes an island of light swallowed by endless black fields? Tonight's story takes us to the Suncrest gas station, a lonely outpost on a forgotten highway. For most drivers, it's just a blur of fluorescent lights in the rearview mirror. But for Mark, the overnight clerk, it was his world. Every creak of the doors, every flicker of the lights, every shadow pressed against the glass. He thought he knew the rhythm of the nights, the truckers, the teenagers, the drunks, the quiet stretches in between. But on this night, the silence wasn't just silence. It was waiting, watching. And Mark would soon realize that the gas station he thought he knew had a darkness of its own. The nights always felt longer at the Suncrest gas station. Mark, the overnight clerk, had worked there long enough to know the rhythm of the hours. The early wave of tired truckers, the trickle of restless teenagers testing curfews, the occasional drunk stumbling in for cigarettes or chips, and then, after midnight, silence. It was the silence that got to him. The gas station was tucked along a forgotten rural highway in the middle of nowhere. Cornfields stretched endlessly on either side, and the nearest town was 15 miles away. Cars were rare past midnight, and Mark often found himself staring at the humming refrigerator cases or the rows of faded candy that no one ever seemed to buy. The hum of the lights above filled the space, a constant mechanical drone that was almost comforting. Almost. Mark wasn't easily spooked. He'd been doing night shifts for 3 years, and in that time he'd dealt with his share of nonsense. He'd had drunk men pound on the counter, screaming about lottery tickets. He'd chased away teenagers trying to shoplift beer. He'd even dealt with a guy who stumbled in holding his own bleeding hand, swearing he'd lost part of his finger in a car door. None of it scared him anymore. But that night was different. It started around 1:15 a.m. Mark was behind the counter, thumbing through an old paperback novel he kept tucked under the register when he wasn't stocking shelves. That was when he noticed him. A man. Not a customer. Not anyone he recognized. Just a man. He wasn't at the pumps and he wasn't inside the store. He was standing just beyond the glass doors, close enough to be illuminated by the flickering light above the entrance, but far enough away that his features blurred in the dark. Mark squinted, trying to get a better look. The guy wasn't moving. He wasn't fidgeting or pacing like most drunk late-night wanderers did. He just stood there, staring. Mark waited, expecting the man to push the door open and step inside. Maybe he wanted to buy cigarettes. Maybe he was waiting for a ride. Maybe he was just lost. But he didn't come in. The man just stood there, still as stone, his face partly hidden by the glare of the overhead bulb. Mark cleared his throat and glanced at the door again, waiting for some movement. Nothing. The man didn't even seem to breathe. Finally, Mark leaned over the counter and called out, his voice echoing strangely in the hollow quiet. "Hey, you need something?" No answer. The figure didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't react in the slightest. Mark frowned. This wasn't unusual behavior for drunks, but most would at least mutter something, stumble around, or try to open the door. This guy just stood there. Minutes passed. Mark tried to ignore it. He ducked his head back into his book, told himself the guy would wander off. People did weird things all the time. But every time he glanced back up, the man was still there. Something about the way he stood, rigid, unwavering, made Mark's skin crawl. He wasn't leaning, he wasn't shuffling, he wasn't moving. Just staring. After 10 minutes, Mark gave up pretending he wasn't unsettled. He reached under the counter and quietly flipped the lock on the doors just in case. Not that anyone ever came in this late, but it made him feel better. The man still didn't move. At this point, Mark pulled the old security monitor closer. The gas station had a cheap set of black and white cameras covering the pumps, the aisles, and the entrance. The footage was grainy, but sure enough, there he was. Frame after frame, the man stood frozen. Mark leaned in, studying the screen. The angle of the camera caught just enough of the man's face to see that his eyes, deep, hollow, unblinking, were fixed directly on the glass. On the inside. On him. Mark jumped slightly, his book falling from the counter. He stared at the door. The man hadn't moved. The silence pressed heavier now. Mark tried calling out again, louder this time. "Hey, store's closed. You okay out there?" Nothing. Not even the slightest shift of his head. Mark considered stepping outside, but the idea filled him with unease. Something about leaving the barrier of the glass felt wrong, like he'd be giving something up. Instead, he paced the length of the counter, pretending to tidy the register. But his eyes kept flicking back. The man never moved. 2 hours passed like that. 2 a.m. came. Then 2:30. Then nearly 3 o'clock. Every time Mark glanced up from the cameras or the door, the man was still there. Standing. Watching. At one point, Mark picked up the store phone, his thumb hovering over the keypad. Who was he going to call? The police? And say what? That there was a man standing outside his gas station? That wasn't illegal. That wasn't even unusual in the grand scheme of things. He hung the phone back up. But something deep inside him whispered that this wasn't just a drunk. This wasn't just a loiterer. This was something else. The way he never wavered. The way his eyes didn't blink, didn't shift. The way he seemed less like a person and more like a statue carved from shadow. Mark couldn't explain it. He just knew it. And when the clock hit 3 a.m., the buzzing of the lights grew louder. And Mark's stomach dropped. Mark didn't realize he was holding his breath until the bulb overhead fizzled out with a faint pop, plunging half the store into shadow. The man outside hadn't moved in nearly an hour, yet when his head tilted, just slightly mechanically, it was enough to send a bolt of cold dread straight down Mark's spine. Mark rubbed his palms against his jeans. It's just some drunk, he reminded himself. But drunks didn't stand there for hours. Drunks didn't keep their feet so perfectly rooted in place that it looked like their soles had melted into the cracked pavement. He forced himself to look away, grabbing a broom from the corner. Sweeping was his nervous habit, the thing he did when he couldn't sit still. The bristles scraped against the tile, but every few strokes he found himself glancing up at the front window. The man was still there. Still staring. Not moving. Not breathing. Or maybe Mark couldn't see him breathe from this distance. Maybe he didn't want to. The next night, Mark clocked in again. He told himself he was being ridiculous the night before, that it was exhaustion, and overactive imagination. Still, he couldn't stop his pulse from quickening when the automatic doors slid open at 11:55 p.m. and the cool night air rolled in. He scanned the lot before starting his shift, but it was empty. Just the skeletal glow of street lamps, painting long shadows across oil-stained pavement. For the first hour, things felt normal. The hum of the fridge. The occasional ding of the microwave when he heated leftover pizza. A truck driver came in for coffee and left without small talk. Mark even convinced himself the man wouldn't be back. But when the clock hit 1:47 a.m., he froze mid-bite. Because there he was again. The man stood in the exact same spot, right in front of the glass doors, just far enough back that the automatic sensors didn't trigger. He hadn't walked up. Mark would have heard the crunch of gravel, the scuff of boots. He hadn't driven. There were no headlights, no engines fading into silence. One moment the lot had been empty. The next he was there. And once again, staring. Mark's stomach turned. He deliberately busied himself behind the counter, stacking candy bars, pretending he couldn't see. But that almost made it worse. Every time he stole a glance at the convex security mirror overhead, the reflection confirmed it. The man hadn't moved. Didn't blink. Didn't sway. Didn't breathe. Mark sat stiff in the stool behind the counter, eyes fixed on the locked glass doors. The figure outside hadn't moved an inch. The tilt of his head remained unnatural, almost bird-like, as though he were studying Mark from a vantage point humans weren't meant to take. The buzz of the lights above drilled into his ears. His nerves were so frayed that the sound had started to feel physical, like static crawling across his skin. Every time one of the bulbs flickered, Mark's heart skipped, waiting for it to burn out completely. The rows of candy and dusty chip bags seemed to ripple under the uneven light, casting jittering shadows against the linoleum floor. He tried to distract himself. Pulled out the logbook, flipped through the scrawled notes from clerks who worked shifts before him. Nothing useful. Just petty complaints about stocking inventory and drunks knocking things over at the pump. But one note snagged his attention. A single line scribbled hastily in different handwriting than the rest. "Don't let them in." Mark's throat went dry. He shut the book, shoved it under the counter, and tried not to look at the glass again. But his gaze dragged there anyway, like metal to a magnet. The man was still there. Still staring. Mark pressed his palm against the counter, grounding himself. He reminded himself he'd locked the doors. Double-checked. Triple-checked. The keys still dangled from the loop at his belt. Nobody could get inside without them. The sudden quiet after the truck's noise made the emptiness even worse. The world outside seemed hollow, as though the gas station were the last structure left in existence. The figure's pale face at the window seemed brighter in contrast, lit faintly by the overhead canopy light above the pumps. He never blinked. Minutes dragged into hour. The clock ticked toward 2:45. Mark's chest tightened. It was happening again. Same time. Same motionless watcher. He flicked his eyes to the CCTV monitor. 3 grainy black and white feeds. The pumps, the lot, the aisles. Each one washed in static lines, struggling to hold focus. He adjusted the dial to clear the screen, but as the image sharpened, his gut dropped. The man was staring straight into the camera. Not at the window. Not at the door. At the lens itself. Mark leaned back, throat closing. He looked out the window in real time. The man hadn't moved. Head tilted. Eyes fixed on the counter. But on the camera he was different. A subtle difference, but enough to churn Mark's stomach. His mouth looked wider, stretched. His shoulders hunched closer, as if he were pressing forward. Mark clicked to another feed. This time the figure wasn't outside at all. He was inside. Just standing at the end of an aisle. Mark's hand slammed the monitor button again, cycling through the feeds. Gone. Back outside the door. Then again inside, closer. Then gone. The images blurred into each other until Mark shoved the monitor away and nearly toppled the stool in panic. No, I locked it. I locked it. Mark froze. His eyes shot to the glass door. The man wasn't touching it. He hadn't moved. His hands hung limp at his sides. But the sound, the rattle, still echoed. He gripped the keys on his belt so tightly they cut into his palm. His breath came shallow, uneven. Then silence again. He sat back down, trembling. He told himself he was hearing things. Stress. Sleep deprivation. His imagination filling in blanks. But then, at exactly 3 a.m., the sound hit him like a knife to the spine. Mark whipped his head toward the aisle. Nothing. He darted to the CCTV monitor again, fumbling with the controls, breath hitching. The feeds flickered, static rolling across the screen. Then one frame steadied, aisle 3. Someone was there. Wet footprints tracked along the linoleum, glimmering under the flickering lights. Step by step. But no one cast them. The prints appeared one at a time. Each pause between them filled the gas station with unbearable silence, broken only by the buzzing lights and the faint squeak of water pressing into tile. Mark staggered backward, his heel catching on the stool. He nearly fell but caught himself on the counter edge. His chest burned as panic clawed through him. No, this isn't real. The sparks hissed and faded. In the momentary darkness, Mark swore he saw movement. A silhouette leaning between the shelves, impossibly thin, head still tilted at that sickening angle. When the emergency bulb flickered back on, the space was empty. But the footprints were closer now. And wet. The smell hit him. Damp earth, mold, and something faintly metallic like rusted iron soaked in rainwater. Mark pressed himself against the counter, heart jackhammering. His keys rattled on his belt as his hands shook uncontrollably. Another step. Another wet imprint on the tiles, inches closer to the counter. He didn't even dare look at the front door. He didn't want to know if the man was still standing outside, or if he'd somehow left his spot. His mind couldn't reconcile it, couldn't accept the thought that the figure could be in 2 places at once. But the footsteps kept coming. Slow, patient, inescapable. Mark knew deep in his gut that the next time he looked down the aisle, he wouldn't be alone. The sound wasn't human, and it was getting closer. Mark's heart hammered as the silence pressed down on him like a weight. The register screen in front of him had dimmed into its idle mode, casting only a faint green glow over his counter. He sat frozen, eyes locked on the empty aisles beyond the glass. The bell above the door hadn't chimed. The lock was still secure. He had checked it 3 times already. No one had entered. And yet, the footsteps he had heard still echoed in his memory, steady, dragging, too heavy to be imagination. Mark gripped the edge of the counter. He forced himself to stand, legs trembling beneath his weight. His flashlight, still resting beside the register, now felt like the only thing tethering him to sanity. He clicked it on, the beam cutting a sharp tunnel through the darkened store. Nothing. Just shelves of gum, dusty chip bags, and racks of travel-sized detergent bottles that gleamed in the beam like rows of watching eyes. But then, movement. At first, he thought it was his reflection in the cooler doors lining the back wall. His flashlight beam had bounced, warping his own silhouette into something taller, darker, stretched. But when he angled the light slightly left, he saw it. A wet footprint. Right there on the linoleum by the coffee machine. Mark's stomach lurched. He hadn't seen any puddle. Hadn't heard the door open. And yet, there it was, a slick, shining footprint pressed into the tile. The edges of it glistened as though fresh from a river. He followed it with the flashlight. Another. And another. The prints moved in a trail, weaving between the aisles, almost deliberately circling him. Each one gleamed wet like they were being laid down that very second. Mark spun, the beam slicing through the gloom, but the aisles were empty. He could hear his own breathing now, short, ragged gasps that filled the store like static. "Who's there?" he demanded, though his voice cracked. Then, behind him, a shuffle. Mark whirled around. His flashlight landed on the far aisle, the one lined with motor oil and antifreeze. For just a split second, the beam caught on something pale. A face? No, too fast. Gone. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his stool, and that's when he saw them. The footprints weren't stopping. They weren't fading. They were multiplying. Across the tiles near the counter, near the bathrooms, near the coolers, new wet prints materialized, one after another, as though someone invisible was pacing the store, circling him tighter and tighter. Mark's flashlight jittered in his shaking grip. He wanted to run, but his legs felt heavy, nailed down. All he could do was watch. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw him. The man. Standing at the end of the snack aisle, just there. Not walking. Not entering. Just appearing. His head tilted in that same unnatural angle as before, eyes black and fixed, water dripping from his hair in rivulets down his face and onto his shirt. The fluorescent light above him flickered, painting his form in jerks of shadow and light. Mark raised the flashlight higher, but the beam seemed to weaken against him, as if the figure absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. The man's soaked clothes clung to his body, every drop hitting the floor with an audible splash. Drip, drip, drip. Mark swallowed hard. You need to leave," he stammered, though his voice sounded hollow, like it wasn't really his. The man didn't respond. He just stepped forward. One wet footprint after another bloomed in his path. Mark scrambled backward behind the counter. His hand fumbled for the phone again, but when he lifted the receiver, dead. Not even static this time. Just silence. The man moved closer, his eyes unblinking, locked onto Mark's. He didn't stumble, didn't hesitate. His movements were too smooth, too fluid, like water itself had molded into the shape of a man and decided to walk. Mark's flashlight flickered. "Stay back," he shouted, though every instinct told him the words were useless. The man tilted his head again, impossibly far this time, like his neck wasn't bone but rubber. And then, finally, his mouth opened. But no words came out. Only the sound of rushing water. The shelves rattled. The cooler doors banged as though struck from the inside. Mark dropped the flashlight, and its beam spun wildly across the ceiling, the walls, the floor, catching glimpses of more wet footprints appearing in every direction. He clambered up onto the counter, desperate to get above the spreading water that wasn't really there but sounded like it was flooding the store. His shoes squeaked against the laminate. And then he looked down. The man was no longer in the aisle. He was right there, at the foot of the counter. soaked head to toe, hair plastered across his forehead, eyes fixed upward. The dripping was so loud now it drowned out everything else. Drip, drip, drip. And then he smiled. It was the first change in expression Mark had seen, and it was worse than the silence. His lips pulled back too far, teeth too sharp, too many of them gleaming in the flickering light. Mark screamed, but the sound barely escaped before the lights blew out completely. The air inside the station felt impossibly heavy. Mark couldn't breathe. He couldn't even scream. His throat locked up, like something invisible gripped it tight. The figure was there, standing between the aisles of candy bars and beef jerky, his head slightly tilted, water dripping in slow, deliberate plinks onto the tile. The footprints trailed in from nowhere. Mark knew the doors hadn't opened. The locks were engaged, the metal bar still in place. But there they were, wet shoe prints smeared across the floor, leading straight to where the figure stood. Mark backed up, inch by inch, until he felt the counter press against his hip. His hand groped blindly toward the landline, but it was gone. The receiver, the one he had used earlier to call the sheriff's office, dangled loosely from its cord, lying lifeless on the floor as though something had knocked it away. He couldn't take his eyes off the man. The customer's face was still obscured, shadowed even under the harsh fluorescent glare above. But the dripping never stopped. Mark's knees buckled. His mind reeled. He's inside, but he's outside too. The thought churned in his head like static. The figure took a single step forward. The wet squeak of his shoes against the linoleum echoed through the station. Mark bolted. His body finally remembered how to move, and he sprinted for the back hallway where the supply room and emergency exit were. His boots slammed against the floor, his breath ragged and hoarse. He could hear his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. He didn't look back. Not until he reached the back door. He shoved the push bar, expecting the metal to groan and the door to give way into the freezing night air. But the bar didn't budge. The door didn't move. It was as if it had been welded shut. Mark spun, gasping, and for the first time since the figure had appeared, the store was empty again. The aisle stretched out before him. The counter was deserted. The glass front revealed nothing but the dark, empty parking lot beyond. No man. No footprints. No dripping. Everything was exactly as it had been when his shift started. Mark stumbled back against the door, clutching his chest. Sweat poured down his forehead. He was shaking so violently he thought his bones might crack. Slowly, he crept forward, retracing the path back to the front of the store. His boots scraped against the floor, and that was when he noticed it. The footprints were gone. Completely. The linoleum gleamed under the light of the buzzing fluorescence, spotless, as though no wet shoes had ever touched it. He staggered toward the counter, desperate to convince himself it had all been some kind of hallucination, some trick of exhaustion and paranoia. He grabbed the receiver, lifted it, and pressed it to his ear. He dropped the phone instantly. The crash echoed through the station like a gunshot. Mark didn't wait for anything else. He didn't clock out. He didn't check the time. He ran. Straight through the front door, which, impossibly, swung open without resistance. The cold night air slammed into his lungs as he sprinted across the gravel lot toward his truck. His keys trembled in his grip, nearly slipping as he shoved them into the lock. He climbed in, turned the ignition, and floored the gas pedal until his tires screamed against the dirt. The gas station shrank in his rearview mirror, its buzzing lights flickering like a dying lantern in the dark. He didn't stop driving. Not until the sun came up. Not until the station was miles behind him. And he never went back. The next morning, when the day shift clerk arrived, everything was normal. The counters were clean. The floor spotless. The cameras functional. But when the owner reviewed the footage, there was nothing. The camera feed showed Mark standing at the counter. Standing still for hours. Never moving. Never speaking. At 3 a.m. he simply dropped the receiver and walked straight out the front door. No customer. No footprints. No dripping. Just Mark, alone. He never came back for his final paycheck. Never answered the owner's calls. Never responded to the sheriff's follow-up report. It was as if he'd driven off that night and vanished. And the station? It's still open. Still lit at night by that same buzzing glow. Another clerk works the overnight shift now. Sometimes they complain of a man standing by the window. Sometimes they say he tilts his head at 3 a.m. just as the lights flicker. And if you ever find yourself passing through on a lonely highway night, keep driving. Don't stop for gas. Don't look too closely through the glass, because maybe the man outside isn't really outside. So, what do you think the cameras really missed that night? If stories like this leave you glancing over your shoulder, you're not alone. Subscribe to Mind's Abyss, where I share true horror stories every single day. Your next stop might just be darker than you think.